Yeah, my name's Kurt Wichern. I've been a software developer for a while, and I've been helping a lot of companies out recently with their cybersecurity documentation as a submission to the FDA. So over the last 10 years, the FDA has become more and more sophisticated when it comes to the tasks that they require us to do as medical device manufacturers, and more understanding of like what actually goes in to create a cybersecure device. And one of the things that I've seen since they've released this new cybersecurity guidance document in September in 2023 is that we're still kind of all learning about how this all works, right? We as industry and as the FDA is still kind of learning about exactly what they want to see in a submission and what actually provides reasonable assurance that our medical devices are cyber secure. So this last year, I've worked with several companies in their dealing with their additional information requests from the FDA around their cybersecurity. And one of the things I've found is that a lot of these clients I worked with, they have a fundamental misunderstanding of exactly what the FDA is looking for, and a misunderstanding of tasks and activities that they can do to ensure their device's cybersecurity, not only during product development, but throughout its entire life cycle. Next slide. Yep. All right, thanks. So one of the challenges that I've come across is that a lot of these clients of mine don't understand when they need to start thinking about cybersecurity. Like, we should start, as medical device manufacturers, we should start thinking about cybersecurity when we are coming up with new product ideas. So like when we're on the lunchroom and we're drawing new product ideas on the back of a napkin, that's when we should start thinking about cybersecurity considerations and challenges. Not only for keeping the device cyber secure while it's being used, but throughout its entire life cycle. We got to think about the cybersecurity challenges that exist while we are developing it, after we developed it and we're transferring it to manufacturing, like to a contract manufacturer, or if we've created some sort of app, we're putting it up to an app store, what cybersecurity issues exist there, how are we going to update it, how are we going to securely update the device, and then what sort of activities do we need to do to securely decommission the device or securely allow our customers of these devices to dispose of them. Next slide. Yeah. So one of the things that I found that has been really beneficial in helping me as an engineer and helping my clients is to think about the cybersecurity risk analysis not only as a device but throughout its entire life cycle. And I found some, this is a difficult topic, right? Because if you Google like how to create a cybersecurity risk analysis, or how to create a cybersecurity threat model, you're going to see, for a medical device, you're going to see some blog entry says, risk analysis is risk analysis. You need to follow 14971, and your cybersecurity risk analysis should follow that. And you find like some other blog that says cybersecurity risk analysis is fundamentally different than safety risk analysis, and so you should not be following 14971. And so there's a lot of confusing information out there, and like most things, right, like it's kind of a combination of both, right? So your cybersecurity risk analysis are two fundamentally different things, but they do follow similar processes. And from, like we talked about, like you need to be thinking about your cybersecurity not only as a product, but throughout its entire life cycle. Next slide. All right, so what I want to do is I want to go through an example of how to create a cybersecurity risk analysis for a medical device. And this is just one example. There's several different ways we can do this. So if your organization has another way to do it and it's working for you, then by all means keep doing that. My hope is that if we can present an example, that then you can take this example and use it for your own devices and your own use cases. So the first thing we want to do when we're creating a medical device cybersecurity risk analysis is we want to be able to define what we're trying to protect. We want to be able to define the assets of the system. And so what I like to do, I just like open up Excel doc, put in a tab that's called assets, and I want to define every single asset of the system. And it's going to be portions of the device. Like let's say if we have some wearable, right, like some wristband or some implantable that captures some medical information about ourselves. It transfers it to an app on a phone, which then transfers it back to some cloud backend. And all three of those products do some sort of analysis or some sort of medical device function. And so they're all considered part of that asset structure. And so The wearable would be be an asset. The phone would be an asset. The firmware on the wearable would be an asset. The app would be an asset. The cloud service would be an asset. The whatever app we have written on that cloud service would be considered an asset. So all these physical and software portions of the device or components of the device would be considered assets of the system, along with information. So the information that we pass back and forth between these devices is considered an asset of the system. So if you have and it's important, I think, to separate these out into kind of different buckets, because you're going to tailor your risk controls based on the safety of the information and the impact each of these different assets of the system have against the rest of the ecosystem of the medical device. So with information, you want to talk about like your error messages and diagnostic messages of the device are different than like your personal health information that you have in there, or any other sensitive information, like maybe like a username and password that you have, the information you have in the system. And so you want to make sure that's separated out as different assets within your cybersecurity risk analysis. And then I also like to put in communication channels. So in the example we're talking about, if you have a Bluetooth communication channel between your wearable and your phone, that Bluetooth communication channel is considered an asset of the system. But then we also got to think about this, like we talked about, not only just the device, but the entire life cycle of the device. So there are assets of the system that exist just in the life cycle, and that would be like your development computers accessing like an online repository of your code, like a GitHub or Azure DevOps. You want to think about how we transfer that approved binary from our QMS to a contract manufacturer, like what assets of the system exist in there. How do we ensure secure updates? So if we have an app that gets loaded up to an app store for an update, in-field update after we get approval, we do some minor change. We don't have to do another submission to the FDA, but we want to put that up on the App Store. Like that entire process also there are assets of the system in that. And then also, are there any decommissioning tools we need to either wipe information from the system or whatever we need to do before we throw away the device? Next slide. All right, so once we have all the assets defined, I make another tab and I talk about the threats. So there's different threat agents that can occur for these medical devices. And some of them are adversarial and some of them are accidental. So an adversarial one is like, just a hacker who's trying to figure out your system, and that could be, lots of different things. Different, like it could be someone who's just like a regular hacker. It could be some like disgruntled employee that's gone off to try and do something. And there's also accidental threat agents. Would be like a user does something that exposes the vulnerabilities of the system, or it could be like a natural disaster, like there's a fire or an earthquake, and it destroys some of this back end infrastructure you have in place, and so you have to go back through and kind of figure out how to craft your entire system so that there's no vulnerabilities that are exposed during these disasters. And then this also, when I talk about threat agents, this is where I kind of connect it to Stride. Who here is familiar with Stride? Has ever heard of that before? Okay, excellent. You can go to the next slide. So Stride is a threat modeling technique that was developed by Microsoft a number of years ago, and it's kind of a mnemonic to kind of help us remember what sort of things that we can look at when we think of a threat agent or a threat, how they can affect our device. So it stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. So what I like to do is when I have all of those threat agents defined, I want to specify which threat agents are applied to which of these portions of Stride, because the FDA also wants to see us use some sort of threat modeling technique as well, like this. All right, next slide. All right, so when I have all that figured out, right, I got assets, I got threat agents. Now I want to determine what vulnerabilities exist in my system. I create another tab on the spreadsheet, and then I start going and looking at what vulnerabilities could possibly exist. And there are some great resources out there. CWE has different like top 10 lists of like the top 10 mobile weaknesses, the top 10 hardware weaknesses, the top 10 firmware weaknesses. And OWASP also has also great things like the top 25 software mistakes that engineers make. And so I like to look through all of these lists and pull out different vulnerabilities that I think are going to apply to this specific device. And there is a lot of there's a lot of similarities between some of these lists. Like some of them will go in and say, a lot of them talk about authentication, right? So authentication, like improperly setting up your authentication between different devices as a potential vulnerability for your system. And so you want to list things like that. and define how your system could be affected by these vulnerabilities. All right, next slide. All right, so once I have all three of these tabs figured out, that's when I want to go through and bring it all together to create a comprehensive cybersecurity risk analysis. So that's where I go through and ask the question, how can this specific threat agent exploit a vulnerability on a given asset? And so I create risks on that analysis based on every single one. So a vulnerability could have multiple entries on this table, depending upon how it affects different assets of the system and how different threat agents could exploit that vulnerability in order to find more information about the system or gain control over your medical device. So then, like all things, like we have this list, we need to evaluate it for its risk. So in 14971, it talks about the probability of occurrence and the safety, right, of your device. We can't use those for a cybersecurity risk analysis because this isn't safety focused. This is security focused. And so there are the FDA guidance document talks about using CVSS, which is Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It also talks about there's like a NIST standard out there that talks about exploitability and impact, which is what we're going to talk about. And there's also, you could create a custom method on how you want to evaluate your cybersecurity risks. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so this is just taken from it. You can see at the bottom of this, this is from the NIST Special Publication 800-30 Revision 1. And I've gone through and shortened down a lot of these explanations to make it fit on the slide. But I like to do a 1 through 5 scoring system for exploitability. So this kind of takes place of that probability of occurrence you'd see in a normal risk analysis. I want to talk about exploitability. So the very high is that anybody could come in and exploit a vulnerability with very little knowledge in order to figure it out. And then as you go down the list, you need more and more sophisticated tools and more knowledge in order to exploit a specific vulnerability. So a 1 very low is that it's really like the only person that can exploit it is someone that actually built the device, a disgruntled employee who has left and has gone through and is trying to figure it out later on. All right, next slide. All right, so and then we also want to evaluate it on its impact. So once again, I do another 1 through 5 scale. And how is this impact, how is this, like if this vulnerability is exploited, how is that going to affect my device, how it's going to function, the other assets of the system. So once again, it goes through 1 through 5 scale, and a 5 is like it's going to have catastrophic effects, and a 1 is going to have very little effect on our system. All right, next one. And then we want to evaluate all those risks. So I didn't put it on the slide, but I usually create like a 1 by 5 matrix, right, where we have exploitability and impact, and then I have parts of it that are considered low risk, and those are generally acceptable. Parts that are considered moderate risk that are only acceptable if like risk control measures, any more other risk control measures can't be implemented, or that there's some it might impact the benefit of the device, and then there's risks in there that are unacceptable no matter what. And so I have that criteria specified in our evaluation criteria, and then apply that to how we scored the risks. And then also, this is the important part, is that each vulnerability risk that we have identified could potentially have a safety risk as well. Like if somebody exploits this vulnerability and gets control of the system or does something, then it could have some association with our safety risk analysis. So I want to have some sort of process in place where I take every single cybersecurity risk and I reanalyze it against our safety risk analysis to see how it connects, if it does. Okay, next slide. All right, and then once we have that figured out, then we want to figure out what our risk control measures are. And so our risk control measures, generally we're going to create product requirements, or we're going to create other software requirements or design inputs that are going to feed back into the design. But we also might create process requirements in order to help mitigate some of these risks. So some of those process requirements could be like, okay, we want to make sure we have multi-factor authentication set up on our GitHub account so that we are positive that only people within the project can access our software. We want to make sure our contract manufacturer has a secure process in order to go into our QMS to pull out our approved binaries to put onto their system in order to program our devices on the production line, and ongoing with like in-field updates and any decommissioning activities. All right, and then like most risk analysis, we need to verify or at least link to verification of our risk control measures, and there are kind of two two buckets this falls into, right? We want to verify that all these design inputs have been completed and are working, and that's through design verification. But we also want to verify that they're effective, and that's when we get into our penetration testing and our SAST and DAST testing. So SAST is static analysis software testing, and DAST is dynamic analysis software testing. And this is where it's important to find a third party that specializes in penetration testing, because that's what the FDA wants to see. Is they want to see some like severe division between the people that developed the product and the people that are running the penetration test. So I've used Blue Goat Cyber in the past. Vulmetric's been really good. Red Sentry. There's several companies out there that just focus on medical device penetration testing, and most of them are really good, and they provide comprehensive reports, and they also provide a way where you do the penetration testing. They give you recommendations on what to fix, and then you could go back through and retest as part of the package. And it's important when you're reviewing that that initial penetration test, is you apply that back to your vulnerabilities that you've identified to see if you've missed any, and apply it, and make sure your vulnerability. The vulnerabilities you've identified have been updated to match what's also been presented in the penetration test. All right. And then you want to do some sort of post-mitigation reevaluation using the same criteria as before, both exploitability and impact, to demonstrate that your product, like with these risk control measures, your product provides a reasonable assurance that it's cyber secure. And you want to apply that same risk acceptance activity or risk acceptance criteria. And then when anything that falls in the yellow or the red area of your risk acceptance criteria, you need to create a benefit risk analysis where you show that that applying additional risk controls are not feasible, or that they impact the benefits that are provided from your product. And this is really where it comes in. Security kind of meets usability, because we can create something that's incredibly cyber secure, but it's completely unusable. And so we really have to figure out what those trade-offs are. That yes, something might present some cybersecurity risk, but if we close that cybersecurity risk, our product becomes unusable. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Mark.
Thank you very much. I wonder if anyone has a question now they might like to ask before we forget.
Okay. Yeah.
So how often do you recommend revalidating or taking a look at the cybersecurity testing you did, given that the landscape is ever changing?
Yeah, so that's another part of that the FDA wants to see, is in like some sort of cybersecurity management plan. I generally recommend that you want, depending on what you have, right, you want to rerun penetration testing once a year, and you want to rescan your vulnerability, your SBOM for vulnerabilities at some cadences that. And along with that, I recommend, like every time we rerun penetration testing, to re-review your cybersecurity risk analysis to see if there's anything that you've missed or anything you need to add to it.
So follow-up to that, how open is FDA, I guess, does FDA take into account what a reasonable bad actor could do? Or I've seen clients that have, a board built inside, it's completely sealed in, but it has a USB, and FDA says, okay, you need to do cybersecurity testing, USB there. Do they take into account like what a reasonable bad actor could do, or do they just expect you to do it all?
They take into account what a reasonable bad actor would do if you have a good story that you can craft through your cybersecurity risk analysis. So I had a client that had that same issue, right? They said it's not a cyber device, but they had a USB, and the FDA came back and said this is a cyber device, because they didn't do any testing on, like, they knew that if they plugged in like a USB to Wi-Fi adapter, it wouldn't do anything, but they had no proof that existed, so they had to go back there and redo that. Yeah. Sorry, so there's another hand there. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, related to your question, on our device, we decided to not have any onboard storage because we thought that would save us, and we're only going to use USB storage. But I forget which comment you made, but I realized that USB could be a failure point.
Yeah.
That's on the hospital, not on us, but do we have to take that into account?
Definitely, yeah. I would create a cybersecurity risk analysis around that and say, like, okay, if someone plugs in like a Wi-Fi enabled USB, how is that going to affect? Like, or if they're going to be able to, like, I'm not sure if you have like a BIOS or any sort of operating system on there. Yeah, but if they plug in like a Linux bootkit or boot disk, are they able to boot into that OS and then gain access to your system? And so the controls you want there is you want like some like password protected BIOS, and you want to be able to disable booting from the USB.
Thank you very much.
Hey, no problem. Any other questions?
All right, great.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, I know people might forget the question, so I figured we'd start that way. I have to stand up and walk around because I'm kind of like a nervous 4-year-old most of the time, so forgive me for that. But the thing that we have in common is UL. If you've ever seen this little marker, we We do cybersecurity testing as well, and I'm here to talk about some risks that I see in the world. I got interested in onboarding training. Well, first of all, let me just ask a couple of quick questions. You got to know your owners. How many of you are in the medical device business? Wow, nearly everybody. Pharmaceuticals? A little bit. If it's combination devices, you have to raise both hands. Okay, thank you very much. And then the other question is, have any of you ever heard of compliance wire? I see some folks nodding their heads. So I work with compliance wire a lot, more than you. And by the way, most of your training is overdue, and we're watching. Okay, so, but I got super interested in onboarding because I think it's an area that is ripe for some regulatory change. I think it is a super high investment, and most of the folks that I talk to are in operations really hate it. Like, I have to hire somebody and I got to wait 18 months for them to be able to get on the floor and do some work for me? Are you kidding? You know? I always hear people talking about how new people are overloaded, but I never see any data about it. Well, I happen to have a lot of data. So I want to give you a global picture of what the heck is going on and why it scares the heck out of me. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, I'd appreciate it. So if you don't know Compliance Wire, it's been around for over 20 years. It's a cloud-based learning management system. It's part of many people's quality management systems. We've got a lot of customers, and I get to play with 727 million plus training events that have been collected over some number of years. And I actually, you know, my colleague Felix calculated the number of people who've ever been on the system, and it's 7 million. It's a fully validated system, so I'm very confident in the records and things things like that. But you know, when I try to estimate how many people work in the life sciences globally, I come up with a number of about 7 million. So while not everybody's on Compliance Wire now, a lot of people have been on Compliance Wire at some point in their career, and yes, I have your records. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. It's a really good data set. I'm not going to spend time on this. If you want, you can see the slides and talk to me later. So I tried to start characterizing what was going on with onboarding, and because I don't know what people are doing with the system, right? I have the data, but I don't have what their intent is most of the time. I just have to do some descriptive statistics around it. So the first thing I asked was, how many things are people assigned to do in the first 6 months, and then how many of them do they complete? So, simple question. And then I'm looking at those kinds of things on average. So I had a quick sample. I took everybody who started new in 2023, January 1st, and ended at about July of 2024. So about a year and a half's worth of data. And I had 98,000 people that started. So when I did an average of the number of things that they're assigned, if you look at those averages there, assigned, completed, and completed with equivalencies, if you're, you know, highly trained, I can give you an equivalent completion for something. I can give you credit for your life. So that's nice. So you may not have to take that training. But still, even if you add those two things together, people are only completing on average about half of the stuff that they're assigned in the first 6 months. And then, you know, I don't look at averages, just averages. I look at the mean, the median, the mode, and I look at the distributions. And you can see some of those things in the table on the right there. And, you know, the average is 10, just like it shows on the graph. But just look at the max. The max is the highest value. Someone is assigning someone else 1,279 items to do in the first 6 months. What else are they doing? Anything? And then when I look at those completions, look at the max completion. It's 191. So I don't know if they're the same person, right? Maybe that 191 did everything that they were supposed to do. But this distribution is way out of whack. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. Let's just go back a little bit to Statistics 101. You know, you have the mean, the median, and the mode. You have these things called outliers, right? And the way we typically define an outlier is we look at the range between the 25th and the 75th percentile, multiply that little thing by 1.5, and if they're outside that range, we say this data is nuts, we're not going to look at it, right? Outliers. Next slide, please. We have a lot of outliers, 13,000 within that distribution, and this is the distribution of the items, just the items assigned. So the thing that I noticed about this is, you know, the lines go from to show you where the mean is, 2 is the median, the 50% point, so that line shows you where the median is. And then, you know, there's a super long tail in these data, and it's a little crazy. So I don't like looking at it this way, so I did another thing, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. So I just did a scatter plot. So the scatter plot takes the 2 coordinates of your assigned number and your completed number, and it plots them within a little scatter plot. And if you look at this scatter plot, what you're going to see is, you know, the items completed are on the y-axis, the items assigned are on the x-axis, and everybody is behind. Everybody. So to me, I look at this and I say, isn't that a risk? Like, what are these guys doing? And is this process actually efficient enough to meet the needs of the industry? And my answer is no. And it's not just one company. There's 367 in the data set, and 226 of them had a lot of outliers. So everybody's doing it. And we all know the definition of insanity. You do the same thing over and over again, you expect a different result. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. So then I said, okay, well, let me just see if I can categorize these jobs. Maybe some people are getting it done and some people aren't getting it done. So this is the average items assigned and completed as a function of what your job level was. So you can say, okay, well, maybe my executives are the worst. Well, actually, they're not. I mean, they're not finishing their training either. But the people that are having the most challenge, I think, are sort of the middle management folks, you know, because they're probably the most busy and harried and all the other stuff. So they're not quite getting their stuff done. C-suite, you can look at analysts, assistant. It's not good performance overall. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. And then I just looked at it a different way. Job functions. So these job functions are like clinical. I made these up. I tried to get standardized job functions from the Department of Labor, but there's nothing that really quite fits medical devices and pharma. So I got clinical, engineers, finance, HR, IT, laboratory, manufacturing, medical. And I did this by looking at all the job titles, and I used some AI algorithms to take a look at the root words and, you know, kind of categorize all these things in an automatic way. And you can see the ones that scare me the most are the clinical one. There's such a wide delta between what you're assigned and what you do. And, well, they all scare me. The one anomaly is the medical one. And I think that's the most often one where physicians, if there's a physician in here, I apologize in advance, when they say, I'm too busy saving lives to take that training, and I've been doing GCP since I was 12, so I'm not going to do your training. Okay, fine. Okay, people have that problem all the time. But it's reflected in the data. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next. I'm going to skip this slide. You can have it. It's industry subsegments like CMOs, CDMOs, resellers, stuff like that. Just looking at it at a high level, life science people, I have some non-life science folks on my system. Life science people are by far, you know, the most harried, if you will, and the medical device folks are doing a little bit worse than the pharma in terms of what we're assigning. I think that probably makes more sense. Some of the things they do are a little bit more complex than small molecules, at least, maybe not biologics. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next one. And this is the one that really kind of kills me. It's like I looked at what people were doing as a function of the type of training that was there, okay? So computer-based training modules, SCORM is also a type of computer-based training module, so those are all computer-based training modules. ILC is instructor-led course, right? So that's a teacher in front of a room. Control documents, those are your typical standard operating procedure PDF kind of thing. And you can see that, boy, we rely heavily on this, and I've got another slide on this. And only sometimes are we testing people afterwards. So a control document with a quiz is an SOP followed by some type of learning assessment. And then forms are used for on-the-job training. That's when the supervisor is over your shoulder. Show me how you do this lab method. Do the lab method 3 times correctly, and then I'll qualify you, right? So that's what that is. And CVs, everyone, education, training, and experience. That's the education part that people put in there. So they usually get their resume uploaded into the system, thankfully. When I look at even larger sets of data, so I did another analysis that had about 66 million observations in it. And mind you, this is across the whole industry, 130 countries, right? The reliance on SOPs is enormous. And only about 24% of them are even paired with a learning assessment. And if you think about models of learning on the job, you know, there's the 70-20-10. Most of the stuff you do is learn is on the job. You know, 20% is from interactions. Hey, Joe. Hey, Mary. How do you do this? And 10% is formal educational events. Too many SOPs. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next one. This is the one that really kills me, is that I collected the time stamp of when the person opened the SOP and when they earned the completion in the system. And I plotted the frequency of the duration. So what this chart really means is you take that 54 there, that's a 2-minute slice. And what that is saying is that 54% of these documents are open less than 2 minutes. I did another cut at 30 seconds. It's not much better. It's worse. And 85% are less than 10 minutes. So, number one training method, least effective training method. All right? Also, number one FDA citation, by the way, is failure to follow our SOPs. That's the number one citation 4 years running. And then there's some other things for the quality. Anyway, next slide, please. Here's where I think the problem is. And it goes back to what they were saying in the main sessions today about a regulatory regime that, as far as I can tell, this one's from 1978. In 1978, there was no personal computers. There was nothing. So when this thing was written, and if you read it, just take 1 minute and just read this. Maybe you've read it before, but just read it for a second. How could you not read that and think that you have to train people on documents? Like, the way the language is in there, you could twist it a bunch of different ways if you want, but it primarily is saying you got to train these folks, and these written procedures have to be done. And I'm not saying get rid of SOPs in any way, shape, or form. Somebody's got to do them. All I'm just saying is it's not the optimal way of doing it. Did you have a point, sir?
Have you seen a differentiation between US-based companies and US, maybe in Europe, under different requirements?
No, I have not. It's only because I haven't asked the question yet. But it's a great question. I will say that of the, I think I have about 1.6 million people on the system. About 500,000 of them are in Europe. So this is reflective of that total thing. All right, next slide, please. When you're learning something, the first thing, or the first way that most people learn things is with some type of verbal description. I'm not talking about riding a bike, because you can't learn to ride a bike at a seminar. That's a great book. If you want to read it, it's out there. But as you get skilled at something, verbal information is mostly useless. Next slide, please. Does anybody know how to change a tire? Yeah, I know how to change a tire. I'm pretty slow at it. But what you really want is you want people that are trained, they know exactly what they're doing, they've done it a couple of times, and they can change that tire in 5 seconds and do it right. That's what you want. But I don't think that's what we get. And with all of the quality problems that we see in manufacturing, where are they coming from? Generally, the instrumentation works well, particularly if it's calibrated. So I got to turn to a couple of solutions, and I'm going to shut up, and maybe we can have some discussion. But what do you do about it? And for me, it's, look, give people whatever they need from a safety perspective so that they can get out onto the floor. Gowning, everything, you know, it's a little bit different on the aseptic side and so forth, but get those things out of the way and get as much of the training into the point of use as possible with someone supervising who is a qualified trainer that can sign off on it, and you're going to do much better. Because the things that we're doing and the effort that goes into creating these documents, and then people maybe not reading them, maybe there's less effort because they're only open for 2 seconds, there's not a lot of effort there, but it takes time, and people are being assigned so many things, it's crazy, right? So do that stuff as quickly as possible from a safety perspective, get it out on the way, and then start people doing. How do we learn? We learn by doing and getting feedback. That's how people learn. It's been going on for millennia. Next slide, please. And then if you're trying to train something, there are methods of training that map well to the type of content. And I won't belabor this point much, but for everything that you're trying to get people to learn, there's a different method to use. And most of the things that you're trying to get folks who are in, like manufacturing or something to do are manual skills. So you want them to be doing those procedural things and practicing on those instead of just reading or not reading documents, as the case may be, and responding to quizzes. Next slide, please. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Happy to have some discussion or any questions around it. The thing that I'm doing I'm not going to be around forever, so I have limited time left. We all do. One thing I want to do is get some kind of change to the wording, whether it's a guidance document or something that just says to the industry that you can actually use different training methods than documents. Thank you.
Is there a concern that reducing the amount of training documents, because obviously there are a lot, will give rise to common knowledge that's just shared without training officially?
That's always a concern, but you're going to have to handle that with your qualified trainers, right? And I'm not saying maybe that document is not really meant to be read ahead of time, but meant to be a work instruction at the point of use, because that's when you need it, and your memory might fail. That's why we did your question first, because maybe you wrote it down, but maybe you didn't, and you might have had a question occur to you, right? Do things immediately.
Any other questions? Here, I'm going to pass this around because we're not able to capture audio without it. So yeah.
My question pertains to, I'm in the startup field. We have 5 employees, and I'm in charge of the training. My method so far has been, I want everybody to understand every system, but I have been concerned that I'm over-training, but I figure we're a small company, so much responsibility. In your experience, is that approach reasonable, or do you see a difference in startups versus larger companies in training strategy?
Absolutely. most of this data comes from people and companies that are probably 50 employees or over. So I do think you have to have a different approach for a startup. But, you know, at least at my company, we make resources available on a, you know, like an on-demand basis for smaller companies, so you can get some of the stuff. The training that we've developed was co-developed with the FDA on regulations. We had a cooperative research and development agreement with them. So it's all, you know, gold standard stuff, and you can find it on demand. And if you want to have some of that available to you, you can. But yes, you can overtrain those folks. Absolutely. You gotta go by role.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of experiences, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on it. In a former company that I worked with, I would we had this established training where they started telling us not to read any more than 5 SOPs per day, and seemingly to be able to establish that you can't possibly absorb more than a certain amount per day of training. Much less recall very much of it. and so I thought that was a good approach. Another one was when I was training some new hires as a manager, I would go through the trainings with them as they're onboarding, and I classified each of their trainings as sort of A, B, and class A, B, and C to say, well, okay, these are the safety ones along with the ones that are immediately responsible for your job in performing it. And then as those SOPs had less and less directly to do with them, I would classify them in the lower classes. And so I just wonder what your experience has been in the industry in trying to mitigate that.
Yeah, the first one that you mentioned, limiting the number per day, is a common approach that I see across a lot of our clients, and it makes sense. Do I know the number of things you can learn in a day? No.
It was really just arbitrary.
I think you're just trying to manage the chaos, right? Because that stuff is chaos. And then the second thing that you described is something that we kind of preach as well, which is a risk-based approach. But we start at the patient, right? So anything that would impact a patient, has high probability and high risk to a patient, that's number one, and it might get multiple methods. And as you back off from there, and taking into account the type of behavior you're trying to produce.
Right, and that was the process I had because I work in regulatory, so, you know, certain aspects would have direct possibly effect on patients down the road if, you know, we're not doing our job correctly and sending out the proper regulatory.
Those are very sane approaches, and you're probably going to get fired for that.
That's right. I love it. Just the comment, in one of those slides you had controlled documents and then controlled documents with a quiz, and those were less than 25%. And I just know that from my personal experience over the last 10 years, most of those quizzes are, did you read the document and do you understand it? Yes or no? Yes. Congratulations, you got 100%. And I'm like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I feel like a participation award for playing soccer. So, yeah.
That data point, by the way, was a full quiz, not just a read and sign. The read and sign was there for every one of those completions.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
How often do you see companies throwing the book of procedures at employees? You know, I work in regulatory. How often do you see the regulatory individuals getting, you know, sales training SOPs and other things, which is maybe not relevant?
I apologize. I missed the first part of your question.
How often do you see companies doing that? I saw your, you know, the one, you had a data point that had 1,200 trainings. How often do you see trainings that are just thrown out there with companies not actually paying attention to who it's going to?
A lot. In fact, we have built checks and balances into the system. If someone generates an assignment that goes over a certain number of people, then it gets flagged for review. And that's a parameter that gets set in the system. And most of that is the result of an admin who assigned something to everybody, and the CEO's office says, why am I doing this? Yeah, so that happens, absolutely.
Related follow-up to that is I've assigned like our overall quality manual, the summary, to everybody because I want everybody to have a good idea of the whole system. But this discussions make me wonder, especially hands-on training that you say, is maybe that counterproductive and I should focus more on how it applies to ex-employees?
Well, yes, scenarios are probably one of the, and stories around them are probably one of the best learning tools for those. And if you're trying to learn a process, right, you know, there's a couple of techniques like backward chaining. Start with the end, then add one piece, but be having people practice it over and over again, right? If you're trying to get people to learn a process, you got to get them to produce the process from memory, unless they've got some kind of aid there that tells them that, because they're going to forget. Like, I'm going to read your quality manual. I'll get like 3 or 4 points out of it that I might find some, I'm old, you know, I've been around for a long time. I'll find 3 things that are different for your company, and I'll be like, I'll focus on those. Because I kind of know what GMP requirements are, right? And many of your folks do. So why not just test them?
Yeah.
You know, we have a feature of our course creation tool that starts with a pretest, and then if you miss something, then it down selects the content that you're going to receive, you know, because we want to give you credit for what you know, you know, yeah. Experience, training, and what are the other parameters?
Thank you.
See, I forgot.